Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have an unusual show for you tonight. I go around the world and give lectures about cannabis, and one of them I call Cannabis the First 12,000 Years. So I gave that as a virtual presentation at a Mexico event called Aquaponics within the past year. And we're going to run that for the next 2 weeks. We're going to have half of it tonight and the other half next week. So stay tuned for that. But first we have our hemp news after we bring on the infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Hey, welcome to Hemp News. Our first story tonight, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, is officially recommending that marijuana be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under federal law. A historic development that means the top health agency no longer considers cannabis to be a drug with a high potential for abuse and no medical value. After completing a scientific review into cannabis under a directive from President Joe Biden last year, Health and Human Services is now telling the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, that it believes marijuana should be placed in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. It's been in Schedule 1 since 1972. The recommendation is not binding, and the DEA has the final say, but the scientific analysis combined with growing political support for cannabis reform may well influence the Drug Enforcement Administration to make the change. An HHS spokesperson said in a statement on Wednesday, quote, as Schedule 3 drug, cannabis would still remain federally prohibited. However, the rescheduling would have a major implication for researchers who've long criticized the Schedule 1 classification that creates significant barriers for access to studies. Following the data and science, HHS has expeditiously responded to President Biden's directive, according to an HHS spokesperson. They said, quote, the DEA was issued this on August 29th. This administrative process was completed in less than 11 months, reflecting this department's collaboration and leadership to ensure that comprehensive scientific evaluation be completed and shared expeditiously, end quote. For researchers, this would mean they would no longer need to go through the onerous registration process with the Drug Enforcement Administration in order to access cannabis for studies as a Schedule 1 drug. National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA director Nora Valco, has been vocal about the issue, saying at one point that she herself avoids researching Schedule 1 substances due to the barriers. Bloomberg reported that NIDA signed off on the HHS marijuana recommendation. For the industry, the reclassification would allow them to make federal tax deductions that are currently prohibited for businesses involved in the sale of Schedule 1 or 2 drugs. Because of this prohibition, the cannabis industry has faced a significantly higher effective tax rate, and state governments have taken it upon themselves to provide state-level tax relief for their regulated markets. I personally have had my bank accounts closed 20 different times since 2007 for marijuana. Politically, moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 would allow the president to say he's helped accomplish a major reform facilitating administrative review that may result in rescheduling more than 50 years after cannabis was placed in the most restrictive category as the federal government launched the war on drugs. This could also boost momentum for congressional efforts to further reform federal cannabis laws. As lawmakers come back from the August recess and continue to try to pass cannabis banking legislation, they'll be able to point to the Health and Human Services recommendation as evidence of the urgency to normalize the industry. Rescheduling the cannabis plant to Schedule 3 of the U.S. Controlled Substances Act fails to adequately address the federal conflict with existing state legalization laws. Both adult use and medical will continue to be in conflict with federal regulations, thereby perpetuating the existing divide between state and federal marijuana policies. Just as it is intellectually dishonest to categorize cannabis in the same placement as heroin, it is equally disingenuous to treat cannabis in the same manner as anabolic steroids. The majority of Americans believe that cannabis ought to be legal and that its hazards to health are less significant than those associated with federally descheduled substances like alcohol and tobacco. Like those latter substances, we've long argued that cannabis plants should be removed entirely from the Controlled Substances Act altogether, thereby providing state governments, rather than the federal government, the ability to regulate marijuana in a manner as they see fit without violating federal law. Our next story is on medical cannabis. From out of Athens, Greece, patients diagnosed with neurological disorders like epilepsy and Parkinson's disease experience improvements in their symptoms following medical cannabis treatment, according to data published in the journal Advances in Experimental Medicine and Biology. A team of Greek scientists assessed cannabis use in a cohort of 100 patients. Patients' quality of life was assessed via the use of a 36-item health survey. The researchers reported, quote, "The majority of our patients who received medical cannabis to treat their neurological disorders reported decrease in their symptoms, about 58%, better energy and vitality, and an improvement in sleeping and appetite after receiving medical cannabis. Participants who reported a longer period of receiving medical cannabis reported statistically significant more energy and vitality, and also better mental health and general health status," end quote. The data published earlier this year similarly reported that the use of plant-derived cannabis oils containing a balanced ratio of THC and CBD is safe and effective for older patients suffering from certain treatment-resistant neurological diseases, including Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and peripheral neuropathy. This study, Quality of Life in Patients Receiving Medical Cannabis, appears in Advances in Experimental Medicine and Biology. Our next story tonight is from Hamburg, Germany. Cannabis inhalations associated with sustained improvements in pain and sleep in patients with chronic neuropathy, according to data published in the journal Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoids. German investigators assessed the use of herbal cannabis in a cohort of 99 patients suffering from neuropathic pain. Participants in the study inhaled cannabis containing moderate levels of THC, between 12 and 22%, for 6 weeks. The researchers reported, quote, "Within 6 weeks on the therapy, median pain scores decreased significantly from 7.5 to 4.0. The proportion of patients with severe pain decreased from 96% to 16%. Sleep disturbances was significantly improved, with the median of those scores decreased from 8 to 2. These improvements were sustained over a period of up to 6 months. There were no severe adverse events reported," end quote. Other surveys have identified similar pain decreases in neuropathy patients following their initiation of cannabis therapy. The study's authors concluded, quote, "The results demonstrated that chronic neuropathic pain can effectively, sustainably, and safely be treated with medical cannabis," end quote. Data published earlier this year in the Journal for the American Medical Association reported that nearly 1 in 3 patients with chronic pain use cannabis as an analgesic agent, and that many of them substitute it in place of opioids. Our next story tonight is from San Diego, California. Trained police officers are frequently unable to discriminate between those who are under the influence of THC and those who are not, based upon the subject's performance on field sobriety tests, according to data published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry. The researchers affiliated with the University of California at San Diego performed a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial to evaluate whether the use of field sobriety tests are a valid measurement for determining if drivers are under the influence of THC. Consistent with prior analysis, the police officers frequently misinterpreted subjects' field sobriety test performance so that they deemed unimpaired participants who had smoked placebo to be under the influence. Overall, the officers incorrectly classified 49.2% of the placebo group as impaired based upon their field sobriety test performance. The investigators concluded, quote, "The findings of this study suggest that field sobriety tests are useful adjuncts but do not provide strong objective evidence of THC-specific impairment. Additional efforts to validate existing methods and provide law enforcement with new effective tools for identifying impairment are needed," end quote. The authors of an accompanying editorial in the journal added, quote, "Field sobriety tests as administered by highly trained police officers are insufficient to detect cannabis-induced impairment. The legal implication of these findings can be major given that field sobriety tests are currently part of the evaluation protocol in North America to detect drivers who are cannabis impaired," end quote. Some of the study's findings had initially been published in May in the Journal of Clinical Chemistry. The results of the 2021 study by investigators with Johns Hopkins University similarly reported that subjects' performance on key elements of field sobriety tests, such as the walk and turn test and the one-leg stand, showed little sensitivity to cannabis-induced impairment. By contrast, that study's authors acknowledged that the use of the mobile device performance application, Druid, was adequately sensitive to cannabis-induced changes in the subject's performance. We frequently opined in favor of the use of performance testing technology as more reliable indicator of cannabis-induced impairment. In 2017, justices on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled in Commonwealth versus Gerhardt that standard roadside field sobriety tests cannot, quote, "be treated as scientific tests establishing marijuana impairment as a result of cannabis consumption," end quote. They added, quote, "Likewise, an officer may not testify that a defendant has passed or failed any field sobriety test, as this language improperly implies that the field sobriety test is a definitive test of marijuana use or impairment," end quote. This study, Evaluation of Field Sobriety Tests for Identifying Drivers Under the Influence of Cannabis, appears in this month's edition of the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry. Our last story tonight is from Israel. Regulators are further easing restrictions on cannabis patients to medical cannabis products. Regulatory reforms approved by the Israeli Ministry of Health will allow physicians to prescribe cannabis to patients as a first-line treatment rather than as an option of last resort. Under current law, doctors must attest that their patients have been unresponsive to other conventional treatments, including opioids, prior to granting them access to medical cannabis, but no more. About 100,000 Israelis are currently authorized to use medical cannabis. Another regulatory change eases legal restrictions on patients' access to hemp-derived CBD products. Regulators are also seeking to further facilitate clinical trial research involving cannabis products. The regulatory changes are anticipated to go into effect later this year. That's our last story tonight. If you are a loved one or looking for a doctor who can help you get a medical marijuana permit, just give us a call. We have a referral. We can help you find doctors anywhere in the United States. Call us at 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. Now we're going to run a presentation that I made at the Aquaponics conference back earlier this year in Mexico, and we're going to run the first half of it this week, and we'll run the second half of it next week. So without further ado, here is that presentation. I hope you find it informative and help us restore hemp. Good night. Hi, my name is Paul Stanford. I am a political activist from Portland, Oregon, USA, Estados Unidos. And I have been working to legalize marijuana since I turned 18 back in 1978. I'm 62 now, and I've had some success in terms of being the spokesperson for our campaign to legalize marijuana in Oregon in 2012. And perhaps most significantly, I opened clinics to
help medical marijuana patients across the United States, working with 45 doctors in 60 cities across 10 different states. We've helped over 270,000 patients get their medical marijuana permit. But my thesis here today is that we have co-evolved with cannabis for 25,000 years. And cannabis has changed us, and we have changed cannabis. And that we all know that cannabis is medicine for cancer, for pain, for gastrointestinal ailments, for spastic disorders, for neurological conditions. We've co-evolved with cannabis to make cannabis work in many, many different ways. Cannabis will help us. And not only is it physical medicine for our bodies, it's also earth medicine for our whole planet. And we need this vital coevolution, this symbiotic relationship we have with cannabis to continue to help heal what's left of our planet so that we can pass on our most valuable inheritance, life on this planet and culture of our ancestors to our descendants. So I started the campaign for the restoration and regulation of hemp back in 1990. And we worked to educate people with a weekly TV show that started in 1996. We still do that today. And we put marijuana legalization on the ballot to legalize marijuana in the United States. I first went to school in China back in 1998. And I learned that China had the world's largest hemp crop. They grew more hemp than any other country. In fact, China used to be called, they called themselves the country of hemp and mulberry. Mulberry is what the silkworms ate and to make silk, and only the wealthy could afford to wear silk, but everyone wore hemp until recently. And so I went to China and started to import hemp paper and fabric. And I did that as a business from 1988 to 1997. Since we've legalized marijuana in Oregon in 2019, I've been able to cultivate and give away free cannabis. So this is our garden. These plants are directly in the ground, and they're just as wide as they are tall. And so I've grown and given away since 1999 over 3 metric tons, or over 7,000 pounds of high quality cannabis flowers to sick and dying patients. Here's another example of some flowers the night before, or a week before harvest. This is my my nonprofit organization. The Campaign for the Restoration and Regulation of Hemp is a political committee, and the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation is a Oregon nonprofit corporation. And we morphed into the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation Medical Clinics. And that is the business that's helped 270,000 Americans become legal medical marijuana users who could possess and grow cannabis. Cannabis actually originated in Central Asia, north of the Tibetan Plateau. Archaeologists have discovered cannabis pollen in an area going back 25 million years. And about 25 to 30,000 years ago, the cultivation of cannabis spread outside of its indigenous area. And by 25,000 years ago, it had spread to the Huanghe, or Yellow River Valley in China, and into the Tigris Euphrates River Valley in present-day Iraq. By 13,000 years ago, its cultivation had spread to the Mediterranean basin, and archaeologists have discovered hemp pollen indicating farming in present-day Italy, northern Italy, at the northern tip of the Adriatic Sea. And so that is, today it's Italy. Long before it was Rome, long before the Etruscans that preceded Rome, cannabis was being cultivated throughout Europe. And so we don't know what those cultures were. It's definitely prehistoric times, but the oldest Western historian is the Greek Herodotus, who wrote his histories about 5,000 years ago. And Herodotus wrote about the Babylonians. This is actually a etching in stone from Babylon, and it's an image of King Harambe. Harambe is known throughout Western civilization as the oldest and the first lawgiver, the first written, codified system of legal rules, laws that we know of today were written by Harambe in Babylon. And in fact, that image above this etching of a cannabis plant and Harambe is still used as a national symbol for Iraq. Herodotus, though, the Greek historian, wrote about the Scythians up in present-day Ukraine. And the Scythians, according to Herodotus, domesticated the horse using hemp stalks and hemp stems, and they had a practice, we might call it hot boxing. They would create a tent, put a metal basket in the middle of the tent, and hang it on a tripod with hot rocks. And then they would put cannabis flowers on the hot rocks and sit in the tent and commune in their spiritual meetings. So this is some archaeological evidence of the tripods and the altars that they put their hot rocks and the cannabis flowers in. And again, this is from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about that. Now, while cannabis has been cultivated, according to archaeologists, for over 25,000 years, it's been somewhere between 12 and 8,000 years ago, we began to domesticate dogs. And all dogs came from wolves. The scientific name for the wolf is Canis lupus, where all dogs are known as Canis lupus familiaris. Now, the Canis lupus phrase comes from the Roman language, Latin. And in fact, the Romans realized that cannabis was highly effective on dogs. And so that's why the root in Latin of cannabis is the same as the root for canine or Canis lupus, or as we know dogs, domesticated dogs, Canis lupus familiaris. But all dogs came from, according to genetic science, just 4 or 5 wolves about 10,000 years ago. And we have changed dogs, obviously. And today we have a wide variety of dogs. We have little cute dogs. We have big dogs. We have little dogs. There are even variations in the Chihuahua. So this is just in a period of under 10,000 years, we've made these genetic changes. In fact, all of these farm animals that we know currently were domesticated by civilizations that cultivated hemp. So my belief is that the farm animals obviously were domesticated because we could provide food, and obviously hemp was one of the foods we provided them that they really wanted. Now I'm going to talk about Chinese civilization. I went to school in China for a couple of years and imported hemp paper and hemp fabric from China. This is the oldest, the first Chinese emperor, Shang Nung, and he is known to have written a pharmacology, a medical book about various plants. He always wore plants in his garments that are depicted. And so Shang Nung wrote about cannabis as the most useful plant. And as I said, the Chinese actually called their country the land of hemp and mulberry. About 500 years ago, the Manchurians conquered China, and they changed the name when they took over the throne of China to the middle country, Zhongguo. Zhongguo means the middle country. But before that, it was the land of hemp and mulberry for 5,000 years. And Shang Nung started the Chinese civilization that we know of today, about 5,500 years ago. This is an ancient piece of pottery that is over 5,000 years old in a Chinese museum. And in those markings across that was embedded with hemp fiber. So they can find hemp fibers in those. Apparently this had a hemp protected, and that rotted away over time, but there's still hemp fibers in this 5,000-year-old piece of pottery. This is the Chinese symbol for hemp, or cannabis, and it is ma. And so in the Chinese language, there are 4 tones, and those 4 tones change the meaning of the word. In our cultures, in most other cultures, the tone has an emotional context, but in Chinese, it actually changes the meaning of the word. So while this is ma for the 4th tone, the first tone that uses the very basic sound, ma, is the first tone. And so it's ma, ma, it's all a high, steady tone. Ma, ma, and of course that means mother, as it does in every human language. So obviously, ma is one of the most important verbalizations that we have out there. When we talk about the second tone starts high and then goes low. Ma, and ma means horse, and this is the symbol for horse, or ma. And then this next one, this is actually you good. It says ni hao, and that you good. And that's how people in China say hello, you good. And so if you add the 3rd tone to it of ma, it's ni hao ma. And this one goes up and down, ma. And so that is a verbal question mark. Again, a very important concept. So we see the other tones of ma are mother, horse, and a verbal question mark. When you say ni hao ma, that means how are you, or como estás. But when we go to the 4th tone, it starts low and goes high, ma, and that means hemp. This is the current written form of hemp today in China. It's da ma, that's big hemp, da ma. And so the character hemp, that is used in several other words. So you can find this hemp character, ma, in the word for numb, in the word for like you can't feel anything, the word for clever, like you're very smart, the word for indifferent, like I don't care. It's in the word for troublesome. It's in the word for the sparrow, the bird, the sparrow, which loves hemp seeds. And then perhaps something that we all know is the Chinese board game mahjong. Mahjong also uses the character from hemp, but ma, or hemp in China, has been used in funeral rites since prehistoric times, before the Chinese. They've used hemp, and this is a 8,000-year-old tomb found in present-day China, where cannabis plants are placed over the bodies before they are entombed or buried. And so this is one of those examples, but they have found thousands of examples of people buried with hemp plants on top of them. And in fact, hemp and cannabis are integral to China's most important spiritual practice, which is ancestor worship. The Chinese say that a eunuch in the imperial court invented paper from hemp, and that the people would not, the emperor would not see the importance of this new invention, paper. And so the Chinese eunuch in the imperial court pretended to die, and his friends buried him with a hemp tube up so he could breathe. Then they burned hemp paper over his grave. They dug him up and he was alive. And so that is the Chinese myth about the discovery of paper, even though we find archaeological evidence that paper was being used before this myth. Anyway, hemp is still very important in funeral practices throughout China. You know, China changed a lot with the communist revolution, but Chinese culture exists out of modern day China. So a lot of the ancient practices of funeral rites are now only observed in Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, Indonesia. Chinese communities still observe what's called the Wu Fu, or the 5 levels of mourning. If someone in your family, your patriarch, your father, your grandfather passed away, then you have to observe the highest level of mourning. You have to wear this hat made out of hemp. You have to wear hemp clothing, wear hemp sandals, and carry a hemp stalk, a hemp cane for 18 months. And if it was your uncle, it would be 6 months, another one of the 5 levels of mourning. And these 5 levels were enforced by law. If you did not follow the Wu Fu, you would be punished by your community. So this is an example of the Wu Fu garments. This is in present day Malaysia, where they still observe the Wu Fu. You can see that these people are wearing entirely hemp clothing and carrying hemp stalks. This is from Indonesia, a community observing the Wu Fu and mourning their ancestors with hemp clothing. And this is in present day Taiwan, where again, hemp is integral to honoring your ancestors and mourning them. In present day China, in communist China, they still burn hemp paper money to support their ancestors in their ancestor worship practices. And when a relative or a friend has died, they wear a white hemp collar and hemp clothing when they are going to a funeral or observing their mourning process. I'm going to look now at Japan. This is the oldest cave painting in Japan. It's about 12,000 years old, and you can see that the hemp leaf is included here and being brought across the water. And this is the oldest cave painting in all of Japan that they've discovered. Today, in present day Japan, while cannabis was made illegal by the Americans when the Americans conquered Japan at the end of World War II, Douglas MacArthur, one of his first rules was they had to ban cannabis, and they called it marijuana. But one company has about 150 different farms where they cultivate hemp for spiritual practices. In Japan, the primary spiritual practice is called Shinto. And so all Shinto temples are decorated with hemp, and they have to use hemp in the imperial court, in the emperor's court as well. But one company collects the hemp from these 150 farms, and they process it for the Shinto temples. And so this is some pictures from that company. And this is a Shinto temple in Japan. You can see there's a big bundle of hemp fiber, and those are also around the altars. And that white lightning bolt sort of cloth there is also cannabis hemp. So hemp is integral to Japanese spiritual practices. This is another Shinto temple. Again, you see the big hemp bundle with the hemp lightning bolts coming down. But back in 2016, I was honored to go to the first environmental hemp forum in Kyoto, Japan. And I met several people who process hemp fiber into the ornaments that are needed by all Shinto temples. In fact, this is an exhibit inside a Shinto temple in Kyoto. And this gentleman makes hemp Shinto ornaments and goes and teaches other people how to make them as well. This is in a Kyoto hemp temple, a Shinto temple on top of a mountain in Kyoto. And the fellow here who's pointing at this rainbow hemp rope is actually Mr. Ben Dronkers, the founder of Cincy Seeds and Hemp Flax. His Cincy Seeds is the largest hemp seed company in the world. And hemp flax is also the largest hemp provider of hemp fiber materials. They even produce hemp fiber for the euro note, or the money. We'll get back to more of that later. At the 2016 Environmental Hemp Forum, I met Nobuku Niki, and Nobuku Niki is the founder of a family on the northern island of Hokkaido that has been cultivating hemp for the emperor's family for more than 1,300 years. In fact, Nobuku Niki is also the 183rd head of the Niki clan that has been growing hemp for the emperor's ceremonies since I think it's about 700 AD. And he gave a presentation about his family and their sacred rituals in cultivating hemp for the emperor. Back in 2019, well, this is actually Akie Abe. She is the former First Lady of Japan, the wife of Shinzo Abe, who was brutally murdered earlier this year. My wife and I had the honor of sharing the stage at the Environmental Hemp Forum in Kyoto with Akie Abe, the Prime Minister's wife at the time. In 2019, the emperor decided to retire, which was unusual. Usually they retire by dying, but he decided to retire and turn the throne of Japan over to his son. And so that started this sacred process. And this is part of the sacred harvesting of hemp fibers for the emperor's coronation, for the new emperor to take the throne. And so this is a hemp harvest in June of 2019. This is from July of 2019. They have processed the hemp fiber into thread, and they are taking the sacred hemp fiber to a loom to start making it into cloth, where it's made into clothes. And then this is the emperor and his father, the former emperor, at the coronation performing what they call the sacred rice ceremony. So they have to use hemp in conjunction with rice in the coronation or the enthroning of the new emperor back in 2019. So hemp is still integral to Chinese spiritual practices. It's considered, hemp and rice are considered the sacred plants of Shinto. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Egypt. In Egypt, they had many different goddesses and goddesses, and one of them that we're going to talk about is known as Sheshat. Sheshat was considered the goddess of education, writing, and learning. And Sheshat was always depicted with a little bubble, like a cartoon speech bubble, above her head and a cannabis plant. So in Egyptian culture, Sheshat was the goddess of learning and writing, and she's always depicted with cannabis. And here's another more modern representation of Sheshat. They had hemp flowers in Egypt, and this was an urn that's about 4,000 years old that collected hemp flowers. And so there were hemp flower residues in this. Again, this is from Egypt, about 4,000 years old, and it was a pot of hemp flowers. In fact, when they found the tomb of what we call King Tut or Tutankhamun in 1922, it was discovered, they found that the vault to the tomb was tied with a hemp rope, and that this hemp rope had been put there to secure the tomb in 1324 BC. So that hemp rope is more than 3,300 years old, seems to still be doing the job. Now we're going to talk about South Asia and Hindu culture. Cannabis has always been sacred in Hindu culture. It's mentioned in the Vedas, the oldest written texts in the world. The Rig Veda is the first Veda. In the third Veda, they talked about a pharmacopoeia of medicines, and hemp was considered the most important medicine and a very sacred medicine. in the Vedas going back over 5,000 years. And so this is the god Shiva. Shiva was the savior of mankind, according to their belief. The world had been poisoned. All the water in the world, according to Hindu belief, had been poisoned. And Shiva drank all of that poison into his body. And that's why he turned blue. And then he smoked cannabis in a chillum, and he drank bhang, which is a cannabis-infused milk. And that is a part of the sacred rituals involving Shiva and the way Shiva made the world safe for us, according to Hindu religion. But several other gods and goddesses are also associated with hemp. This is also a representation of Shiva. This is Ganesh. Ganesh was always represented with cannabis and mushrooms, and was a god of the most religious Hindu gurus. They would use cannabis to commune with their spiritual practices. And this is Kali. Kali is theoretically came from Shiva, and Kali also was a proponent of hemp as medicine and hemp as a spiritual practice. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about Buddhism. Buddha was a prince in India, and he left his family to become a peasant and to help lead us to enlightenment. And so the Buddha is said to have sat under a Bodhi tree, and he sat there for 3 years in present-day Nepal, and he only ate 1 hemp seed a day for 3 years before he was enlightened. And he decided, instead of ascending to nirvana under Buddhist practices, that he would stay on earth and lead all humanity to enlightenment. But he is said to have reached this enlightenment by eating just 1 hemp seed a day for 3 years. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Judeo-Christianity. Many of us know that Moses went on top of Mount Ararat to meet with God in a burning bush and receive the 10 commandments. This is a representation of Moses talking to the burning bush. And while there's no real direct evidence what kind of bush that was, the artist who created this obviously had an idea. This is a Jewish temple in present-day Israel. It was discovered or made public in 2020, and it's a very small rock room that was found inside this temple. And again, it was like that hot box method of ingestion. They would take hashish, cannabis resin, and put it on top of this heated rock. They would heat that rock up, and then the hashish fumes would fill the air, and the Jewish people would commune with Jehovah or God. This is a depiction of King David being anointed with oil. That oil is hemp seed oil. And so hemp seed oil infused with a large amount of cannabis. They would take about 10 liters or a gallon, 2.5 gallons of oil, and put 3 kilos or over 7 pounds of hemp flowers into that 10 liters and infuse the oil, and then use this highly psychoactive oil to anoint people into the Jewish religion. And so again, this is a depiction of the anointment of King David. This is a depiction of anointing Jesus Christ. And Jesus is his name, but Christ is actually a term that means anointed. So this Jesus, when we say Jesus Christ, we're saying that Jesus was anointed to be a king, and that he was anointed with this highly potent cannabis flower oil. Now, this is a church in present-day Sicily. It's called Monreale, near Palermo, on the island of Sicily in Italy. And this church is from 1100 AD, or about 900 years ago. And inside, there are more than 1,200 paintings on the walls in gold leaf. And out of these 1,200 images that are painted on the walls, more than 100 of them have depictions of cannabis. And these paintings were covered over in glass back in 1150 AD. So over 870 years ago, all of these paintings were covered in glass. And back then, people did not read and write. People in general, when they came to church, they were either learned from the spoken word or they looked at pictures. And so this is a picture inside the Montreal Cathedral on the island of Sicily, and it depicts Jesus healing the sick. And you can see there's a cannabis leaf right there in it. This is another depiction. You can see up above the doorways on the left side, you see Eve at the apple tree talking to the snake. And the next panel to the right shows Adam coming and Eve giving her an apple off this apple tree while the snake is there. Then the next panel shows God and the apple tree. Adam and Eve are covering their groin, and there now is this cannabis leaf above them, depicting knowledge of good and evil. So and the snake is slithering away. So again, people did not read and write then. So learning from these pictures was the way they would learn that. But you can see cannabis had just appeared as soon as they ate the apple. And here's a close-up of that panel. You can see the snake is slithering away, and there's the cannabis leaf between Adam and Eve. And God is there saying, "What have you done?" And then God taught them for a while, and they say, "Oh, we're sorry." But you can see again that the cannabis leaf is there depicting the knowledge of good and evil that were opened when Eve ate that apple. And again, this is another panel from the Montreal Cathedral in Sicily, present-day Italy. I'm not going to try to describe what's going on in these other panels, but you can see that cannabis was considered very, very important to early Christianity. In fact, even the stained glass windows in the Montreal Cathedral show cannabis above Jesus and Mary. This is the top of a bridge, a cupola, in Venice, northern Italy. And so it was one of the main ports in the world at the time, Venice. And this is right at the ports, and over the top of the bridge, it says, "Cannabis protectio," or "Cannabis protect me." The sailors going out to sea hoped that the rigging on their ships, which was made of cannabis, and the sails and the oakum in the between the boards to keep out the water, and the use of cannabis itself as a medicine, that would protect them. Therefore, Cannabis protectio. Now we're going to look a little bit at South America. This is a church in San Rafael, which is in the central valley of Chile. And it is in San Rafael near Los Andes, and at the base of the tallest mountain in the Western Hemisphere, the Aconcagua. So you can see the Aconcagua on a clear day above this valley. And this church was constructed in 1705. And if you look right above the door of this church, you can see you had to walk under this depiction of a cannabis leaf to get inside the main cathedral in San Rafael. And in 1535, the Spanish began cultivating hemp in the Central Valley of Chile. You know, you could see Aconcagua out at sea because it's the tallest mountain in the Western Hemisphere. So it was something they could easily navigate to, and they would get new hemp ropes, new hemp sails, new oakum for between the boards of their ship. It was very, very important to the conquistadors and the Spanish going around the world that they have a good supply of hemp, and they produced it from 1535 until 1972 in the Central Valley of Chile. And so this shows a hemp harvest in Europe, and it was very important. Here's a photograph from Hungary, and again, the people came out in their finest clothes to harvest the cannabis fiber, which is very intense work, but we're going to go forward a little bit more in time. Here's a hemp harvest in the 1930s in Kentucky, and you can see the hemp goes as far as the eye can see. They put it up in bales and let it weather. They called that retting, kind of like rotting, but it's called retting. And then it made it easier to take the long hemp fibers off the stalk of the cannabis plant, leaving the herd behind. Traditionally, that herding was animal bedding. That herd was animal bedding and fuel. They would burn it, but they would save the long outer bast fibers, the bark of the cannabis, to make canvas, rope, lace, linen, paper, and other things. They began to mechanize it. This is a Kentucky hemp harvest in the 1930s. I think it's 1936. And they also had cannabis medicines in our pharmacopoeia until the 1930s. Eli Lilly, Park Davis, even Johnson & Johnson, present day companies that still exist, they all had a variety of cannabis medicine. This is the Johnson & Johnson package. You can see it says salicylic acid and cannabis indica. I collect antique cannabis bottles and tins, and this is a tin that is about this wide, and you open it up and there's a 1 meter long patch of cannabis resin mixed with aspirin, little aspirin sprinkles, and it's backed by cloth, and you can put that on your arm if you had pain, if you had skin disease, if you had cuts. It would protect you and help take away the pain. But again, that was from Johnson & Johnson. You know, back in 1916, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a bulletin, Bulletin 404. It's called Hemp Herds as a Paper-Making Material. Hemp was primarily cultivated for that outer bark fiber that makes canvas, rope, lace, linen, and the finest papers. But the interior herd had been wasted as animal bedding would be burned. Well, this study from the United States Department of Agriculture, Bulletin 404, said that waste product from producing canvas, rope, lace, and linen from bast fiber, that this herd fiber would make more than 4 times more paper than the most productive tree species. Again, this was a byproduct of making hemp bast fiber and hemp seed for food and oil. So this had been a waste product previously, and the Department of Agriculture's study, written by Lester Dewey, said that this waste product could be used to make more than 4 times more paper than trees. This is Henry Ford, who began manufacturing automobiles at the turn of the 20th century. And he, in the early 1940s, made a hemp car where the body was made out of a mixture of hemp fibers, flax fibers, hemp seed oil, and flaxseed oil. Scientists, even today, have trouble distinguishing between flax fiber and hemp fiber. They're very, very similar, but hemp fiber is much longer. Well, this is Henry Ford, and he's swinging a sledgehammer at the body of this experimental car made out of hemp fiber, and the sledgehammer would just bounce off without any scratches. And there are videos out there of this. You can see it in the Australian news production from 1992 called Hemp, the $1 Billion Crop. But this is Henry Ford. And then this is actually money, obviously, from the United States. This is from 1914, and it has the signature of the Department of Treasury as Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury, the money, in America from 1914 until 1938, when Franklin Roosevelt got rid of him. But on the back of this $10 bill, we see this depiction of farming and industry. Well, when you look closely at the farming, they are actually collecting bundles of hemp fiber. You see those fibers are taller than humans, and they collect so they actually depict on the back of the money hemp farming back in 1914 on the US $10 reserve note. Now, Andrew Mellon's daughter married Harry Anslinger, and Harry Anslinger became the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1932. And he is the person, more than any other, that's responsible for marijuana prohibition. Not only did he use lies about cannabis, saying it caused people to kill their family and friends and go crazy, as represented in the movie Reefer Madness, which he directed making in Hollywood. And he directed some other movies like Marijuana, Assassin of Youth. And he told Congress that marijuana was a deadly new drug. Well, they used this word marijuana from Mexico's slang as to play on American racism and anti-Hispanic bias. So they said that marijuana was a deadly new drug. And Harry Anslinger was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1933 until President Kennedy fired him in 1961. But in 1960, he got the United Nations to pass the Single Convention Treaty, and that became the basis of international prohibition of cannabis. So he obviously followed his uncle's dictates in making sure hemp was illegal to protect Americans' petrochemical industries, because hemp fuel will, and it make 3 times more fuel than any other farm crop, and it was a direct competition with petroleum products. In fact, Henry Ford was always a proponent of hemp and plant fuels, ethanol, alcohol, where obviously the petroleum companies wanted to sell you their product. And, you know, anybody can make hemp fuel, but to make petroleum, you've got to pump it out of the ground and build expensive refineries. So it was capital intensive. So only the very rich could produce petroleum-based fuels. They wanted to get rid of hemp-based fuels that anyone could produce on their farm. You know, Popeye the Sailor Man is said to have eaten spinach to gain his strength, but the history is that spinach was a slang term for cannabis. This is the cover of one of the first Popeye comic books in 1934, and I don't think he's smoking the spinach.